My name is Chris Mann, and this is my video on Sam Harris and Charles Murray. First, I'd like to review the rules of logical debate. Now, the details of these rules can be found in the video I labeled Logical Debate 3, and I'll put a link in the description box. Logical debate is a type of debate about what is or isn't logical, where each person tries to change their opponent's mind using logic. It's divided into three major subcategories: scientific, moral, and strategic debate. Now, there are 5 rules. The first 3 rules apply to all types of logical debate, but if you're going to debate about morality, you must follow the last 2 rules as well. Now, rule 1 is to try to change your opponent's mind using logic. Rule 2 is to maintain that your views are logical until you change your mind, and change your mind only for logical reasons. Rule 3 is to limit debate to human actions and facts that are scientifically provable using today's science and technology. Rule 4 is to state that it is morally bad for a person to act hypocritically, and maintain this position. Now, I defined to act hypocritically here. Rule 5 is to state all your other moral views in the form it is or is not morally good or bad for a person to, and then you put in your scientifically provable volitional human action. Alright, now I currently have 2 official on-the-record moral views. The first one is, it is morally bad for a person to act hypocritically, as demanded by Rule 4. I maintain this position. My second moral view is, it is morally good for a person to work hard at work. Alright, now let's move on. So, before getting into Harris's podcast with Charles Murray, I'd like to give you some insight into my thought process concerning race and why I thought Harris was good on this issue until recently. Now, there are some old YouTube videos in which Harris says that there are certain types of information we may be better off not having, and race and IQ may be an example of that. So he brought up this race and IQ issue as an example of something that maybe we're better off not knowing about. So that's why I thought he would be good on this issue. But recently, I've been disappointed. Now, in episode 41 of Waking Up, the Waking Up podcast, he was speaking with Eric Weinstein, and he talks about the need for nuance when it comes to safe ideas that are superficially similar to dangerous ideas. Alright? And this implies that he believes dangerous ideas exist in the first place, but he doesn't give any specifics. And let's see. So he says that eugenics. So in this discussion, eugenics is being used as the example. So he's basically saying, I would imagine that he would say, just because someone proposes eugenics, that doesn't mean he wants Nazi-style eugenics, which is to say, dangerous eugenics. And even then, even in the case of proposing, even if he proposes dangerous eugenics as opposed to safe eugenics, one's offense is not an argument. Now, first of all, it's not possible to scientifically prove that a person is offended. But besides that, this type of argument here basically implies that it is, quote, not morally good for a person to criticize or discourage the proposal of a dangerous idea without first providing a counter-argument, unquote. Now, I treat all views as implied until they are officially and explicitly stated on the record. So, um, so this view that I just stated is meant to be my accurate summary of Harris's views, but it isn't actually his view until he actually states it in this form on the record, in keeping with Rule 5 of logical debate. Now, if he had if he had stated it the way I just did, it would be in conflict with his later statements, because he doesn't tend to actually present counter arguments. He doesn't tend to present arguments against what he would call dangerous ideas. All right. Um, so for context, let me show you, for just so that you get an idea of what's going on here. Um, so I was debating with an alt right guy on the here's an example of the kind of proposal that someone made on the Sam Harris subreddit. An alt right user said that if someone in the skeptic community, um, if someone in the skeptic community proposed the idea that the male-female crime disparity morally obligates us to restrict the legal rights of men, or that it morally obligates us to phase out the male population once female-only reproduction becomes technologically viable, two notions which I have at times entertained seriously, I would again have no problem with that discussion. Now, I asked him about this. I asked him, I said, by analogy, would you have no problem with the idea of discussing the idea of using crime rates as a reason to restrict the rights of all blacks and eventually phase out all blacks? And he said, I personally don't endorse that view. But he said, if someone proposed it, I don't think I would be particularly happy about listening to them, but I think I would listen for at least a little while. Now, what exactly is Sam Harris's counterargument to this? Because so far, all I'm hearing from him is silence. Not that I'm declaring that it's morally bad for a person to be silent on this issue. Here, he says, there are truths that either need to be avoided or need to be just put back on the shelf because they're not worth dwelling on. But we can navigate all these controversial conversations without deliberately misrepresenting the views of our opponents or shirking the burden of providing a counterargument to ideas we don't like. Alright, so first of all, it's not possible to scientifically prove that a person is doing something deliberately, so we have to drop that. And by ideas we don't like, he's talking about dangerous ideas, what he's calling elsewhere dangerous ideas. Alright, so altogether, this implies that he believes that it is morally bad for a person to misrepresent an opponent's views, and it is morally bad for a person to not provide a counterargument to dangerous ideas, to what one thinks are dangerous ideas. All right, so in this sentence here, he seems to have gone further than saying that it's not morally good. Okay, because shirking has a negative connotation. He's going further than saying it's not morally good, and he's now saying it's morally bad. Alright, so then Eric Weinstein brings up the issue of race and IQ. And remember that he's the one who brings up the idea of safe eugenics as well. Alright, so he says, and very often, the people who are most afraid to open a topic have a fear that that topic is going to go south. A simple example would be that I think a lot of people who are afraid about the issue of race and intelligence, one of the most frightening issues, secretly fear that they're going to find something very disturbing. Now, to this, I say, of course. All right. Um, Now, it's not possible to scientifically prove that a person is afraid, that a person is feeling fear, experiencing fear. But then he goes on to say that even if, basically what he's saying is that even if African Americans have lower IQs on average, they may be better at music and sports, as if it all balances out. So he says, like, so very often it's the tell that those who are going after us when we try to actually investigate these things are actually harboring deep fears that we don't have. So this is like saying, sure, safe eugenics may end up being used against blacks, but at least they'll be among the best musicians, on average, on the way to being non-violently phased out. And yeah, so let me just leave it there. Now, in episode 42, Harris speaks with Glenn Lowry, who is a black professor. Now, Harris asked at the beginning of the conversation, what is racism? And this is almost strategically good. He almost got it. I would have asked, what is your definition of to act like a racist? Depending on the definition, it either is or is not scientifically provable. And I'd say that Glenn Lowry's definition is not scientifically provable. It's full of mental actions, as you can see, and yet Harris says he agrees with it. So that's going to be a problem because you can't say that an action is morally bad if you have not defined that action in terms of scientifically provable actions. That's against rule, it's against rule 3. Now, to be fair, in the podcast with Miriam Namazi, Harris implied that it is morally bad for a person to act like a bigot, and it was defined as to act as if you have animosity towards brown-skinned people, Middle Eastern people, or people from other cultures. Now, that was a better definition, but you would still need to give examples of exactly, specifically, what scientifically provable actions does that include. Now, in episode 47 of Waking Up, he spoke with Gad Saad, who is Middle Eastern. He's not white. Gad Saad is a Lebanese Jew who is anti-SJW, and he's opposed to political correctness. But I found problems with Gad Saad's views. Now, Harris starts out by openly wondering about the purpose of seeking information on racial differences in IQ. Gad Saad responds with what I would just consider a standard response, the technical response. It goes something like, technically, it's possible for a person to scientifically study racial IQ differences without acting like a racist, technically. Well, of course, technically. All right? Now, this, first of all, implies that it's morally bad to act like a racist, because he used that word like that. And it also implies that he knows how to define to act like a racist in such a way that it is scientifically provable. And he misses the point of why people would be concerned about how this information could be used. So, yeah, of course it's possible for scientists to have no moral views. Yeah, those are exactly the kinds of people that Sam Harris calls moral relativists in other contexts. And he debates against moral relativists fiercely in other places. Alright, anyway, then Gad Saad uses that technical argument again to to partially or tentatively defend Rushton, J. Philip Rushton, who got money from the Pioneer Fund. Now, he says he got money from the Heritage Foundation, but it was the Pioneer Fund, and the Pioneer Fund is problematic. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, that's just the technical argument again. At the conceptual level, there's no reason that it should be a taboo topic, he says. Technically. Then he says, I think on average, people would construe the genetic explanation as more taboo than the cultural one, if only because it is perceived, at times wrongly so, that it is more immutable, right? There is nothing, supposedly, that I can change about my genes, but culture we can change. And the reason that I say that that's incorrect, incidentally, is because much of who we are, as you know, is really an interaction between our genes and our environment. Genes are turned on or off as a function of environmental inputs, right? Now, he means this to be consolatory, but he misses the point again. The point is, there's a concern about how this information can be used. Alright, so, and then he mentions Steven Pinker, who is, based on what I've seen, the master of the technical argument. Pinker will mention the words racism and sexism without defining them in terms of scientifically provable human actions. Then he'll say something to the effect of, technically, it's possible for a person to study race and gender without acting like a racist or a sexist technically. And he says this as if he's the first person to discover this. So it's really frustrating. Anyway, then Gad said then implies that he knows that having biological explanations can have bad downstream effects. But then he fails to give ideas about how to prevent them. Now, Harris, again, openly expresses reservations. He says, again, I'm a little torn on some of these issues because I do see some of them as just not being a direction worth going. I'm sympathetic with the idea that certain types of research, certain facts, which can be as factual as any other, can be so reliably misunderstood or misappropriated that it's on some level knowledge not worth having. And this is good. He seems to get it in a way that even Gad Saad doesn't. And that's why I still like Harris. That's why I still liked Sam Harris somewhat on this topic. And I hoped that he would independently stumble upon the rules of logical debate like I did. Now here he uses a hypothetical situation, which again expresses that he understands what's going on here. Hypothetically, if just for example, if Koreans are better on average at math than whites, and you introduced me to a random Korean and a random Caucasian, it would not be rational for me to think I knew anything about their mathematical ability based on their racial characteristics. But no one's going to follow that, really, and people are just going to make these blanket judgments about populations based on the facts we find. Now, he's smearing a lot of people here. Yeah, so technically, he said no one's going to follow that. And he said people in general are just going to make these blanket judgments. Yeah, but he may have misspoke here. Some people may do this. Alright. So yeah, he understands what could happen if this information is widely disseminated. And that's good that he's worried about this. So, in response, Gad Saad once again misses the point by saying that he's a purist. And then, unfortunately, Harris reveals that he's playing like devil's advocate to some degree, which is troubling because it implies he's worried over nothing. It implies that, all of that understanding that he just expressed is kind of may not even be worth worrying about. And yeah, that's a problem. He goes on to say that there is no result that could come out about Ashkenazi Jews that I would take personally. Now, on the one hand, it's really convenient for him to say this because his group is the group that seems to have the highest IQ on average. On the other hand, he seems completely oblivious to how this fact fits in with so-called anti-Semitic worldviews, which say that Jews are stingy and greedy, and they become wealthy bankers and elites that control the world from the shadows. And all you really have to do is just listen to recent interviews with David Duke. So, yeah, I'd say that there's something for even Sam Harris to be worried about. Not that it's possible to scientifically prove that a person is worried. Now, in his debate with, as another example, in the debate with when Charles Murray was debating with a professor at Middlebury College, Charles Murray said that a lot of Jews asked him not to publish these IQ results. And amazingly, he seemed to take this as them merely being humble. I mean, he said a lot of Jews asked him not to publish the fact that, on average, Ashkenazi Jews score higher on IQ tests. And even his co-author, Herrnstein, even he asked him, he was saying maybe we shouldn't publish this. And so Murray took this as them being humble, and he didn't realize that there's an entire worldview that this can be used as to justify. Anyway, moving on. After all of that worrying, after all of that talk about how Gadsad is not worried about what might happen to races with lower average IQs, he then starts to express concerns for his particular group. All right, so Gadsad is worried about mass immigration from majority Muslim countries, and he says, if I, as a Jew, say, you know what, I'm not really comfortable with 95% of 100,000 new people coming in, who I know hate me and my children. Oh, really? Is it possible for a person is it possible to scientifically prove that a person is not really comfortable? Is it possible to scientifically prove that a person hates someone? I would say no. And isn't it a sign of identity politics to start something off by saying, as a Jew? Now, Sam Harris later went on episode 17 of Polite Conversations with an ex-Muslim living in Canada named Aina. She asked him, do you think it would be the same to have, say, a group for black pride and white pride? And Harris said, no. And he said, if a black person speaks about black pride, I don't immediately recognize him to be a racist. But if a white person does it, well, that person is he might as well be a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, that sounds like he might be complaining about it or lamenting that fact, so she asks for clarification. Now, this is interesting because it's like he hasn't heard what the alt-right is saying these days, because they say the exact opposite of this. Alright, now he goes on to say that the difference between white pride and black pride is pretty clear, and the historical reasons for the differences also clear. They're also clear. So he sees the historical reasons for this double standard, but he doesn't see the way forward, which is to disallow double standards, as logical debate does in Rule 5. Alright, so then Ina asks him, is there a line that people can cross where they are just written off by you? And she's using David Duke as an example here. Now, Harris says, it's totally possible to be a genocidal madman and have a reasonable idea about whatever, how to install solar panels on your roof, right? Now, she says, yeah, but are you going to go to David Duke for that? In other words, would you be willing to go to David Duke to learn how to install solar panels? And he said, no. There are definitely people I wouldn't want to collaborate with. And he says, or if I were going to, let's say, interview them on my podcast, I would do it in the sense of, it's going to be interesting to talk to this obviously unethical person and see what happens. Now, this implies that it is not morally bad for a person to declare someone's actions to be morally bad before letting him or her speak. So, yeah, when you declare that you would do something in a certain situation, that implies that that action is not morally bad. Now, this is important because he seems to contradict this view when talking about the president of Middlebury College, when the president of Middlebury College did it to Charles Murray. Before Charles Murray spoke, the president of Middlebury College gave a speech in which she declared Murray's views to be morally, or she implied his views were morally bad. And later, you'll see that Harris criticized her action there in that case. So that's going to be a contradiction. All right. So then Sam Harris starts pushing things towards the edge by lamenting that it would be bad for his reputation for him to talk to David Duke, but it would be okay for his reputation to talk to a serial killer in prison. Now, she says that it would be okay for his reputation if he had David Duke on to challenge him. And by challenge she means to criticize or discourage his actions. Now then he says, well, obviously, I would challenge him if I had him on. But when you imagine talking to someone like a serial killer, obviously there's no reason to challenge him on the ethics of killing people, right? It goes without saying that you're against that. So, actually, the truth is, yes, there is a reason to criticize or discourage killing people because it's mandated by the rules of logical debate. Once you have, once you have declared an action to be morally bad, you must criticize or discourage that action to some degree. And no, it does not go without saying that you believe killing people is morally bad. You have to actually say it on the record first. Then, Harris seems to call David Duke a racist. He seems to imply this. He said, and I guess one could take the same approach to someone like David Duke or some other racist or someone who's clearly a person whose commitments you totally repudiate. So he implies that David Duke is a racist without seeming to know that he denies being one. David Duke denies being a racist. And yeah, you could just see this from his recent, just look at some of his recent interviews and you'll say this. All right, so then they get into a conversation about criticism and discouragement schedules without recognizing it for what it is. So it's possible to debate over the time, place, and manner in which someone should criticize or discourage an action. So here they are debating over the frequency with which Sam Harris would have to criticize or discourage David Duke. on the podcast. Ina wants him to do it at least once during the interview, but Harris seems to want to find a way to do it 0 times, like a scientist or a journalist. But if he did that, he'd sound like a moral relativist, unless he plans to, I don't know, do it before or after the interview. Now here, Ina says, but I think people could benefit from seeing someone like you dismantle his arguments, for instance. So I think there is value to that. And even though she says it would be beneficial to see him dismantle David Duke's arguments, he says it's so obvious what's wrong with racism that it doesn't need to be spelled out for 2 hours. Really? Oh, really? Because I'm beginning to suspect that Harris wouldn't even know how to debate against someone like David Duke. He would probably find it harder than he thinks it is. Yeah, Cenk Uygur went ahead and debated against him, so why won't Harris? So yeah, I think he's, yeah, he. So I think that this contradicts the moral view that he implied earlier, that it's morally bad for a person to not provide a counter argument to dangerous ideas, what one believes to be dangerous ideas. So this is him saying that he's not going to provide the counter arguments. And then here, he just once again dismisses David Duke as wearing his stupidity on his sleeve. Again, that's not a counter argument, as he would say. It's not an argument. Okay, so later they start talking about when Dave Rubin had an interview with Tommy Robinson. So at one point, so Harris points out that at one point during the interview, at the beginning, Dave Rubin asked Robinson if he has any racist motives, and Robinson said no at the time. Now, of course, that's not good enough. And when Ina pointed out that it's not good enough, Harris said, but a real racist would say, I want to live in a neighborhood with white people. I don't want to see brown-skinned people in my neighborhood, right? And Ina said, but you do know there's so many degrees to racism, right? A lot of open racists will say they're not racists. There's even white supremacists who say they're not racists. And Harris, but if they're at all committed to the agenda of white supremacy, it's got to come out somewhere in the conversation. And Ina says, maybe not in an hour-long conversation. This exchange is interesting because it shows that Harris doesn't know who he's up against. His definition of to act like a racist seems to include segregationists and white nationalists. And that's informative, but they themselves use a different definition of the word racist, and they wouldn't necessarily call themselves racists. Of course, there are also those who would refrain from even calling for segregation, even though they want it. Now, just in case you don't know, I want to show you how the leader of the alt-right movement debates. Richard Spencer, who is not to be confused with Robert Spencer, was interviewed by David Pakman. And here you can see that Richard Spencer sees Jews as fundamentally different from whites. As a white nationalist, he wants other races and ethnicities to be peacefully relocated because he believes multiracial societies will ultimately end in chaos. Here, Pakman says that he's Jewish, and he asks Richard Spencer why it would be necessary for them to live in separate nations despite them being able to have such a civil conversation as the one that they're having there. Richard Spencer's response is that By merely identifying himself as Jewish, he has shown that he is not assimilated. He says, true assimilation would mean that you would not say that you are a Jew. Now, the same kind of logic would apply to Harris. So Spencer would use the same logic against Harris because Harris self-identifies as a Jew. And so Spencer would say that Harris has not assimilated. So then my question to Harris is this: is the idea of peacefully relocating Jews out of a white ethno-state an example of a safe idea that's adjacent to a dangerous idea? What would Harris's counter-argument to this so-called safe idea be? All right. Now later, Packman gets Richard Spencer to confirm that he won't denounce Hitler or the KKK, which is to say that Spencer won't declare that their actions are morally bad. Now, technically, it's possible to refrain from declaring those actions morally bad without explicitly without implying that those actions are not morally bad. So you can refrain from saying an action is morally bad without implying that they are not morally bad. You can just keep your mouth shut. Now, I'll remind you that I currently have only 2 on the record official moral views. And that's because I'm using Occam's razor. I am refraining from explicitly stating any moral views beyond what is absolutely necessary. Now, Spencer, however, seems to be refraining for a completely different reason based on what he said here, and especially based on the fact that he just condemned the actions of a murderer who tried to kill Jews. All right? Earlier in the interview, he condemned this action here to try to kill Jews. This killer, Glenn Miller, failed to kill those. He was trying to kill Jews, but he ended up killing Christians. Now, technically, it's possible that this condemnation here, which implies that it's morally bad for a person to try to kill Jews, was meant to cover Hitler's actions already. So Spencer doesn't feel the need to do it again. So Spencer could be objecting to the criticism discouragement schedule that's being pushed on him. It's like he thinks that since he already criticized or discouraged the killing of Jews, he doesn't feel the need to do it again in the same interview. Like maybe he only thinks it needs to be done once per interview or something like that. Or the other possibility is that he doesn't want to tie his followers' hands in advance. He doesn't want to tie their hands in advance when it comes to certain actions that Hitler took other than killing Jews. Now, lastly, before we get into the discussion between Harris and Murray, here's a small piece of what Jared Taylor said on The Stark Truth. Jared Taylor was the white nationalist who inspired Richard Spencer to create the alt-right movement. The host of this show, this podcast, asked, you talk about your solutions. You gave some examples. Do you think a lot of white advocates advocate too radical of positions? And Taylor said, oh, I don't know. Now, the way I see it, this could mean either that there are moral positions that are too radical for him to hold, but he doesn't know if a lot of white advocates actually advocate for them. Or it could be that he doesn't know if there's such a thing as a moral position too radical for him to hold. He goes on. He goes on to say, I think at this point it's more important to talk about the implications of what's happening now. The fact is, American Renaissance, which is the foundation, the group that he founded, has always recommended only two policy changes. One would be to just stop all immigration now. The other is to get rid of all private anti-discrimination laws. If it got to the point where those policies were enacted, the racial consciousness that would result in those policies would probably result in other policies too, but it's impossible to predict what they might be, and I don't think it's necessarily useful to do so. Now this is important, you see. So this shows that he's thinking in terms of strategy. Those two policy changes are supported by many people who are not alt-right. There are libertarians who want to exempt private companies from the Civil Rights Act. So for strategic reasons, Jared Taylor is refraining from explicitly stating on the record what other policies he supports. He seems to realize that the alt-right's goals may not be reached if they are too open about the policies they support. So he implies that, given the goal of creating a white ethno-state, it is strategically bad for a person to advocate for more than these two policies. So, yeah, basically, you have to keep these kinds of people in mind when debating this topic. Alright, now moving on to the podcast with Charles Murray. So this was on episode 73. Now here, Harris is basically saying, people don't want to hear several facts. Now, based on the context of this, he seems to be implying that it's morally bad to not want to hear certain facts. Now, it's not possible to scientifically prove that a person does or does not want to hear something. So views like this are not, you're not allowed to base a moral view on an action that's not scientifically provable. But what is illogical about this is that he says it as if he doesn't know why some people would act as if they don't want to hear it. But then at other times, he acknowledges the same concerns, those same concerns as being legitimate. Alright, and this is going to be a recurring theme throughout the, this is just a recurring theme. Happens a lot. He says, unfortunately, the controversy over the bell curve did not result from legitimate good faith criticisms of its major claims. Now, this does not mean that he thinks that there were no good faith criticisms of the major claims. It just means that the controversy was over Murray studying this issue in the first place. And that's fine. He then goes on to say, rather, it was a product of politically correct moral panic that totally engulfed Murray's career and has yet to release him. Now, he uses politically correct with a negative connotation here. And so that implies that there's a type of moral panic that is morally bad to participate in, and a type that is not morally bad to participate in. But he doesn't give any details about the difference. Alright, now, Charles Murray was going to give a speech at Middlebury College, but the protesters, they stood up and they were chanting, and they prevented him from giving the speech. And afterwards, someone took the text of his speech and showed it to a group of professors and asked them to rank it in terms of whether or not it's a liberal or a conservative speech. And basically, they assessed it as being slightly right of center. And based on this, Harris then says the man is not Heinrich Himmler. But this implies that he believes, first of all, this implies he believes that it's morally bad for a person to act like Heinrich Himmler, who was in charge of the SS. Now, Harris's willingness to imply this is what separates him from Richard Spencer, for example. So yeah, that's a good thing. The fact that he's willing to imply this in the first place, that's a good sign. But my second point is that there is no contradiction here. With this statement, Harris failed to point out a contradiction. It's obviously possible for a conservative person to give a liberal sounding speech, let alone a centrist one. So yeah, the students were protesting based on Charles Murray's previous statements, the ones in the bell curve, not based on the contents of that particular speech on that day. But Harris knows this. He knows that it had nothing to do with the speech he was going to give that day, based on what he said on the recent episode of We the People Live, number 86. Alright, so anyway, he says, but because I had assumed, as many of you probably have who've heard about the bell curve controversy, that when seemingly respectable people are calling someone a Nazi and a fascist and a white supremacist and a eugenicist, well, then there must be something wrong with him. So here, he's implying that it's morally bad for a person to act like a Nazi, a fascist, a white supremacist, or a eugenicist. But he doesn't define those things in terms of scientifically provable human actions the way he's supposed to. And also notice that he seems to have forgotten about Eric Weinstein's distinction between safe eugenics and dangerous eugenics. Now maybe that was an honest mistake here.